In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time, long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts, plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Travellers, travelling through that happy valley, through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. And round about his throne were sitting Porphyrogen, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, O never morning shall dawn upon him desolate. Round about his home the glory that once blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. Wanderers now wandering through that sad valley, through two red little windows see spirits moving discordantly to a sad melody. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Motley, in association with BIC and IFA and Simon & Schuster, present to thee, in anticipation of the approaching Halloween, a tale of the Ragged Mountains by Edgar Allan Poe. A tale of the Ragged Mountains. During the fall of the year 1827, while residing near Charlottesville, Virginia, I casually became acquainted with a Mr. Augustus Bedloe. Now this young gentleman was remarkable to me in every respect and excited in me a profound interest and curiosity. I found it impossible to comprehend him either in his moral or his physical relations. Of his family, I could obtain no satisfactory account. Whence he came, I never ascertained. Even about his age, although I call him a young man, there was something which perplexed me in no little degree. He certainly seemed young, and he often made it a point of speaking about his youth, yet there were moments when I should have had little trouble in imagining him 100 years of age. But in no regard was he more peculiar than in his personal appearance. He was singularly tall and thin, his limbs were exceedingly long and emaciated, his forehead was broad and low, his complexion was absolutely bloodless, his eyes were large and round like those of a cat, his mouth was wide and flexible, and his teeth were more wildly uneven, although sound, than I had ever before seen a pair of teeth in a human head. The expression of his smile was by no means unpleasing, as might be supposed, but it had no variation whatsoever. It was one of profound melancholy, of a large and faceless, unceasing gloom. Now these peculiarities of person appeared to cause him much annoyance, and he was continually alluding to them in a sort of half-explanatory, half-apologetic strain, which when I heard it first impressed me very painfully. I soon, however, grew accustomed to it. It seemed to be his design to insinuate rather than directly to assert that physically he had not always been what he was, that a long series of neuralgic attacks had reduced him from a condition of more than usual personal beauty to that which I saw. For many years past, he had been attended to by a physician named Templeton, an old gentleman, perhaps 70 years of age, whom he had first encountered at Saratoga, and from whose attention while there he either received or fancied that he received great benefit. The result was that Bedloe, who was wealthy, had made an arrangement with Dr. Templeton by which the latter, in consideration of a liberal annual allowance, had consented to devote his time and medical experience exclusively to the care of the invalid. Dr. Templeton had been a traveller in his younger days, and at Paris had become a convert in great measure to the doctrines of mesmerism. It was altogether by means of magnetic remedies that he had succeeded in alleviating the acute pains of his patient, and this success had very naturally inspired the latter with a certain degree of confidence in the opinions from which the remedies had been induced. Dr. Templeton, however, like all enthusiasts, had struggled hard to make a thorough convert of his pupil, and so far gained his point as to induce the sufferer to submit to numerous experiments. By a frequent repetition of these, a result had arisen which of late days has become so common as to attract little or no attention, but which at the period of which I write had very rarely been known of in America. I mean to say that between Bedloe and Templeton there had grown little by little a very distinct and marked rapport or magnetic relation. Now, I am not prepared, however, to assert that this rapport extended beyond the limits of the simple sleep-producing power, but this power itself had attained great intensity. At first attempt to induce the magnetic somnolency, the mesmerist entirely failed. In the fifth or sixth, he succeeded very partially and only after long continued effort. Only at the 12th was the triumph complete. After this, the will of the patient succumbed rapidly to that of the physician, so much so that when I first became acquainted with the two, sleep was brought about almost instantaneously by the mere volition of the operator. It is only now, in the year 1845, when similar miracles are witnessed daily by thousands, that I venture to record this apparent impossibility as a matter of serious fact. The temperament of Bedloe was in the highest degree excitable, enthusiastic, sensitive. His imagination was singularly vigorous, and no doubt it derived additional force from the habitual use of morphine, which he swallowed in great quantity and without which he would have found it largely impossible to exist. It was his practice to take a very large dose of it after breakfast or after a cup of strong coffee, for he ate nothing in the forenoon and then set forth alone or attended only by a dog upon a long ramble among the chain of wild and dreary hills that lie westward and southward of Charlottesville, and are there dignified by the title of the Ragged Mountains. Upon a dim, warm and misty day, toward the close of November, and during the strange interregnum of seasons which in America is termed the Indian summer, Mr. Bedloe departed as usual for the hills. The day passed, and still he did not return. At about 8 o'clock, having become seriously alarmed at his protracted absence, we were about setting out in search for him when he made his appearance, in health no worse than usual, and in rather more than ordinary spirits. The account which he gave of his expedition and of the events which had detained him was a singular one indeed. You will remember, said he, that it was about 9 o'clock in the morning when I left Charlottesville. I bent my steps toward the mountains, and about 10 entered a gorge which was entirely new to me. I followed the windings of this pass with much interest. The scenery which presented itself to me on all sides, although scarcely entitled to be called grand, had about it an indescribable and to me a delicious aspect of dreary desolation. The solitude seemed absolutely virgin. I could not help imagining that the green sods and the grey rocks upon which I trod had been trodden upon never by the foot of a human being. So in fact secluded and entirely inaccessible is the entrance to this ravine, that it is by no means impossible that I was indeed the first, the very first and sole adventurer that had ever penetrated its recesses. The thick or peculiar mist or smoke which distinguishes the Indian summer now hung heavily over all objects, and seemed no doubt to deepen the vague impressions which these objects created. So dense was this pleasant fog that I could at no point see more than a dozen yards of the path before me. This path was excessively sinuous, and as the sun could not be seen, I soon lost all idea of the direction in which I journeyed. In the meantime, the morphine had its customary effect. That of enduing all the external world with an intensity of interest. In the quivering of a leaf, in the hue of a blade of grass, in the shape of a trefoil, in the gleaming of a dewdrop, in the breathing of the wind, there came a whole universe of suggestion, a gay and motley train of rhapsodical and immethodical thought. Busied in this, I walked on for several hours, during which the mist deepened around me to such a great extent that at length I was reduced to an absolute groping of the way. And now, an indescribable uneasiness possessed me, a species of nervous hesitation and tremor. I feared to tread, lest I should be precipitated into some abyss. I remember too strange stories told to me of these ragged hills and of the fierce and uncouth men that tenanted their groves and caverns. 1,000 vague fancies oppressed and disconcerted me, fancies the more distressing because vague. At length, my attention was arrested by the loud beating of a drum. Dom! My amazement was of course extreme. A drum in these hills was a thing unknown. I should have not been more surprised at the sound of the trump of the archangel, but a new and still more astounding source of interest and perplexity arose. There came a wild rattling or jingling sound, as if of a bunch of large keys, and upon the instant a dusky-visaged and half-naked man rushed past me with a sheep. He came so close to my person that I felt his hot breath upon my face. Scarcely had he disappeared into the mist, when panting after him with open mouth and glaring eyes, there darted a huge beast. I could not be mistaken in its character, for it was a hyena. The sight of this monster rather relieved than heightened my terrors, for I now made sure that I dreamed and endeavored to rouse myself to waking consciousness. I called out aloud, I stepped boldly and briskly forward, I rubbed my eyes, I pinched my limbs. A small spring of water presented itself to my view, and here I stooped, bathing my hands and my neck and my head. All this seemed to dissipate the equivocal sensations which had hitherto annoyed me. I arose, as I thought, a new man, and proceeded steadily and complacently on my unknown way. At length, quite overcome by exhaustion and by a certain oppressive closeness of the atmosphere, I seated myself beneath a tree. Presently there came a feeble gleam of sunshine, and the shadow of the leaves of the tree presented itself to me faintly but definitely upon the grass. At this shadow I gazed wonderingly for many minutes. Its character stupefied me with astonishment. I looked upwards. The tree was a palm. I now arose, but in a state of fearful agitation, for the fancy that I dreamed would serve me no longer. I thought that I had perfect command of my senses, and these senses now brought to my soul a world of novel and singular sensation. The heat became all at once intolerable. A strange odor loaded the breeze. A low, continuous murmur like that arising from a full but gently flowing river came to my ears, intermingled with the peculiar hum of multitudinous human voices. While I listened, in an extremity of astonishment I need not attempt to describe, a brief gust of wind bore off the incumbent fog as if by the wand of an enchanter. I found myself at the foot of a high mountain, looking down into a vast plain through which wound a majestic-looking river. On the margins of this river stood an eastern-looking city, such as we read of in the Arabian tales, but of a character even more singular than any there described. From my position, which was far above the level of the town, I could perceive its every nook and corner as if delineated on a map. The streets seemed innumerable and were rather long winding alleys than streets, crossing each other irregularly in all directions and absolutely swarming with inhabitants. The houses were wildly picturesque. On every hand lay a wilderness of balconies and verandas, of minarets and oriels and fantastically carved shrines. Bazaars abounded, and in these were displayed rich wares in infinite variety and profusion. Silks, muslins, the most dazzling cutlery, the most magnificent jewels and gems. And besides these things were seen on all sides banners and palanquins, litters with stately dames close-veiled, elephants gorgeously caparisoned, idols grotesquely hewn, drums, spears, banners, gongs, silver and gilded maces, and amid the crowd and the clamour and the general intricacy, amid the million men turbaned and robed and of flowing beard, there roamed a countless multitude of holy filleted bulls, while vast legions of the filthy but sacred ape clambered, chattering and shrieking about the cornices of the mosques, or clung to the minarets and oriels. From the edge of the city to the banks of the magnificent river there descended innumerable flights of steps, leading to bathing places, while the river itself seemed to force a passage through the deeply burthened ships that far and wide encumbered its surface. Beyond the limits of the city arose in frequent majestic groups the palm and the cocoa and other gigantic and weird trees of vast age. And here and there might be seen the thatched hut of a peasant, a field of rice, a tank, a stray temple, a gypsy camp, or a solitary graceful maiden making her way, pitcher upon her head, to the banks of the magnificent river. You will say now, of course, that I dreamed, but not so. What I felt, what I thought, what I saw, what I heard had nothing in it of the unmistakable idiosyncrasy of the dream. All was rigorously self-consistent. Now, when one dreams, and in the dream suspects that he dreams, the suspicion never fails to confirm itself, and the sleeper is almost immediately aroused. Hence, Novalis errs in saying that we are near waking when we dream that we dream. Had the vision occurred to me as I describe it without my suspecting it as a dream, then a dream it might absolutely have been. But occurring as it did, and suspected and tested as it was, I am forced to classify it among other phenomena.
In this, I am not sure that you are wrong,
observed Dr. Templeton.
But proceed. You arose, as you say, and
descended into the city. I arose, continued Bedlow, regarding the doctor with an air of profound astonishment. I arose, as you say, and descended into the city. On my way in, I fell in with an immense populace, crowding through every avenue, all in the same direction, and exhibiting in every action the wildest of excitement. Very suddenly, and by some inconceivable impulse, I became intensely imbued in what was going on. I seemed to feel I had an important part to play without exactly understanding what it was. From the crowd which environed me, however, I experienced a deep sentiment of animosity. I shrunk from among them and swiftly by a circuitous path reached and entered the city. Here, all was the wildest of tumult and contention. A small party of men clad in garments half Indian, half European, and officered by gentlemen in uniform partly British, were engaged, at great odds with the swarming rabble of the alleys. I joined the weaker party, arming myself with the weapons of a fallen officer and fighting I knew not whom with the nervous ferocity of despair. We were soon overpowered by numbers and driven to seek refuge in a species of chaos. Here we barricaded ourselves, and for the present were secure. From a loophole near the summit of the kiosk, I could perceive a vast crowd in furious agitation surrounding and assaulting a gay palace which overhung the river. From one of the uppermost windows of this palace, there descended an effeminate-looking man by means of a string made from the turbans of his attendants. A boat was at hand in which he shortly escaped to the opposite bank of the river. And now, a new object took possession of my soul. I spoke a few hurried yet energetic words to my companions, and having succeeded in gaining over a few of them to my purpose, rushed and made a frantic sally from the kiosk. We rushed from amid the crowd which surrounded it. They retreated at first before us, fought badly, and retreated again. In the meantime, we were borne far from the kiosk and became entangled in the narrow streets of tall overhanging houses, into the recesses of which the sun had never been able to shine. The rabble pressed impetuously upon us, harassing us with their spears and overwhelming us with flights of arrows. These latter were very remarkable and seemed to resemble in some respects the writhing cries of the Malay. They were made to imitate the body of a creeping serpent and were long and black, of poisoned barb. One of them struck me upon the right temple. Oh! An instantaneous and dreadful sickness seized me. I struggled. I gasped. I died. Ah! You will hardly persist now, said I, smiling, that the whole of your adventure was not a dream. You are not prepared to maintain that you are dead. Now, when I, of course, said these words to Bedloe, I expected some lively sally in reply. But to my astonishment, he hesitated, trembled, turned frightfully pale, and remained silent. I looked towards Dr. Templeton. He sat erect and rigid in his chair. His teeth chattered, and his eyes were starting from their sockets.
Proceed!
He at length said hoarsely to Bedloe. For many minutes, continued the latter, my sole sentiment, my sole feeling was that of darkness and nonentity, with the consciousness of death. At length there seemed to pass through my soul a sudden and violent shock, as if of electricity. With it came the sense of elasticity and of light. This latter I felt not so. In an instant I appeared to rise from the ground, but I had no bodily, audible, visible or palpable presence. The crowd had departed, the tumult had ceased, the city was in comparative repose. And beneath me lay my corpse, with the arrow in my right temple, the whole head greatly swollen and disfigured. But all these things I felt, not saw. I took interest in nothing, even the corpse seemed a matter in which I had no concern. Volition I had none, and appeared to be impelled into motion, flitted buoyantly out of the city, retracing the circuitous path by which I had entered it. When I attained that point of the ravine at which I had encountered the hyena, I again experienced a sudden and violent shock, as if of a galvanic battery. The sense of weight, of substance, of volition returned. I became my original self again and bent my steps eagerly homewards. But the past had not lost the vividness of the real. And not even now, even for an instant, can I compel my understanding to regard it as a dream. Nor was it, observed Dr. Templeton, with an air of deep solemnity.
Yet it would be difficult to say how otherwise it should be termed. Let us suppose that the soul of the man of today is upon the verge of some stupendous psychal discoveries. Let us content ourselves with this supposition. For the rest, I have some explanation to make. Here is a watercolor drawing which I should have shown you before, but which an unaccountable sentiment of horror has hitherto prevented me from showing. We took a look at the picture which he presented. I saw nothing in it of an extraordinary character, but its effect upon Bedloe was prodigious. He nearly fainted as he gazed at it. And yet it was but a miniature portrait. A miraculously accurate one, to be sure, of his very own remarkable features. At least this was my thought, as I regarded it. You will perceive the date of this picture. It is here in this corner, 1780. In this year was the portrait taken. It is the likeness of a dead friend, a Mr. Oldeb, to whom I had become much attached to in Calcutta during the administration of Warren Hastings. I was then only 20 years old. When I first saw you, Mr. Bedloe, it was the miraculous similarity which existed between yourself and this picture which induced me to accost you, to seek your friendship and to bring about those arrangements which resulted in my becoming your constant companion. In accomplishing this point, I was urged partly and perhaps principally by a regretful memory of the deceased, but also in part by an uneasy and not altogether horrorless curiosity respecting yourself. In your detail of the vision which presented itself to you amid the hills, you have described with minutest accuracy the Indian city of Banaras, upon the banks of the Holy River. The riots, the combats, the massacre were the actual events of the insurrection of Chet Singh in 1780, when Hastings was put in imminent peril of his life. The party in the kiosk was sepoys and British officers. Of this party I was one, and did all I could to prevent the rash and fatal sally of the officer who fell in the crowded alleys by the poisoned arrow of a Bengali. That officer was my dearest friend. It was Oldeb. You will perceive from these manuscripts. Here the speaker produced a notebook in which several pages appear to have been freshly written, that at the very moment at which you fancied these things amid the hills, I was engaged in detailing them upon paper here at home. In about a week after this conversation, the following paragraphs appeared in a Charlottesville newspaper. We have the painful duty of announcing the death of Mr. Augustus Bedloe, a kind gentleman whose many virtues and amiable manners had long endeared him to the citizens of Charlottesville. Mr. Bedloe for many years past had been subject to neuralgia, a disease which often threatens to terminate fatally. But this can only be regarded as the proximate cause of his decease. The immediate cause was one of especial singularity. In an excursion to the Ragged Mountains a few days since, slight fever and cold were contracted and attended to with great determination of blood to the head. In order to relieve this, Dr. Templeton resorted to topical bleeding. Leeches were applied to the temples. In a fearfully brief period, the patient died. When it became known that in one of the jar containing the leeches had been introduced by accident one of those venomous vermicular sands that are now and then found in the neighboring ponds of Charlottesville. This creature fastened itself upon a small artery in the right temple,
its close resemblance to the medicinal leech caused this mistake to be overlooked until too late. NB. The poisonous sacs may always be distinguished from the medicinal leech by its blackness, and especially by its writhing vermicular motions, which very clearly resemble those of a snake. You know, I was speaking with the editor of the newspaper in question upon the topic of this remarkable incident when it occurred to me to inquire as to how the name Bedlo had been given as B-E-D-L-O. I presume, said I, that you have the authority for this spelling, for I have always known the name Bedlo to be spelled with an E at the end, as in B-E-D-L-O-E. Authority? He replied, oh, no. It is a mere typographical error. The name is spelled Bedlo with an E all the world over, and I have never known it to be spelled otherwise in my life. Then, said I mutteringly as I turned upon my heel, then has it come to pass that one truth is stranger than any fiction. For Bedlo without the E at the end, what is it but Oldeb conversed? B-E-D-L-O-O-L-D-E-B. And this man tells me it is a typographical error. Lo, 'tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years. An angel throng, bewinged, bedight in veils and drowned in tears, sit in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in the form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly, mere puppets they that come and go, at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings, invisible woe. That motley drama, oh, be sure it shall not be forgot, with its phantom chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth in to the self-same spot, and much of madness, and more of sin, and horror, the soul of the plot. But see, amid the mimic root a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that rides from out the scenic solitude. It rides, in mortal pangs, the mimes become its food, as seraphs sob with vermin fangs, in human gore imbued. Out are the lights, out all, and over each quivering form, the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm, while the angels all pallid, all wan, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man, and its hero, the Conqueror Worm. Edgar Allan Poe, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't his writing crazy in the best possible way? And he was truly someone that is whose work and whose person itself is indescribable. Words fail one when trying to capture the essence of what Poe was all about. Many greats have tried. The French poet Baudelaire was a huge fan of his, and in fact was extremely influenced by him and wrote some wonderful essays on Poe and about his peculiarity and the singular nature of Poe's madness, and also his what Baudelaire referred to as his slightly extraterrestrial accent. There's something otherworldly, almost alien about his works. And this was but a feeble attempt to capture the sort of majesty of this prose, because it truly is, in my opinion, some of the finest, most
intricate and bizarre prose that one has ever encountered, and a source of huge inspiration to me. And it was such a pleasure to perform for you all. Thank you to BIC for having me here, and to IFA, and to Simon and Schuster. And if you all would like to purchase a copy of the novel The Forsaken Wilderness, it's right outside.
Any questions? You can just sort of shout it out. Yeah. I think that'll be enough.
I wondered, was he on drugs?
Yes, he wasn't on drugs, but he was definitely a precursor to sort of the psychedelic poets. Sort of, yes, he was definitely a mental traveler, as it were.
Biographically.
Biographically, yes, he did. As he says in this piece also, there's a great vivid description of morphine, the effects of morphine. And certainly morphine was something to which he was definitely, it was something that affected him. And certainly alcohol. But yes, I'm quite sure that there were certain drugs. But you know, the thing with a person like Poe was that he himself was, I think, endowed with certain really, this thing, as I said, slightly extraterrestrial kind of capabilities. He was also very much someone who was into the cosmic. You know, he wrote this lovely, he calls it a prose poem. It's called Eureka. And it's about the universe. A subject as sort of all-encompassing and intimidating as that. And it's a very difficult read. I didn't understand most of it. But that's his. So he was somewhat of a slightly scientific bent as well.
And there was a murder in which he was somewhat implicated. Or...
No, he was not implicated in it. His own death is itself a yet unsolved mystery. Because no one knows exactly what happened to him. He was found dead, lying on the street on election day actually, in somebody else's, in somebody's uniform and with somebody else's identification card. So there was some kind of conspiracy. There's various theories about what happened to him. Yeah, what a strange and crazy life. And he also note the sort of convoluted nature of his sentence construction. There's any people of letters in the audience. One will know that in today's day and age, the literary tendencies are towards a kind of literary minimalism. I think it's definitely the sort of the Hemingway influence or whatever. A lot of contemporary writers prefer short, clipped sentences as opposed to this long, windy, almost Baroque sentence style that Edgar Allan Poe had. It's called, what he refers to, I don't know if that's the actual term, but it's called circumlocution. The art of saying as little in as many words as possible. What's the opposite of what we're taught, in most sort of literary theory, is to, because even in school, when we're sort of doing composition, the teacher always says, you must say as much in as few words as possible. But certain the writers that influenced me, like Poe and also Conrad, they screeched in the opposite direction. They did the opposite. Their sentence, they deployed certain irregularities of syntax. Their syntax was very interesting, experimental almost, and there was a sort of rhythm to the sentence, a musicality to the prose.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your writing your book out is inspired.
Very much so.
So what are the similarities?
The similarities are firstly the nature of the prose itself, with the sort of the sentence construction style, the syntax, especially the sort of the rhythms, the cadences of the prose itself. It is written in a slightly classical style, with some. It's a very archaic register of prose. It's an almost deliberate attempt to sort of emulate that kind, or pay tribute or homage to that kind of style of prose, which Poe best exemplified. And also, I must mention that there were many offshoots of Poe, because Poe also really spawned a movement called weird fiction. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there used to be these magazines called Weird Tales, like how for crime, there used to be Black Mask magazine where Raven Chandler and many other luminaries got their start in Dashiell Hammett and all. But for science fiction, for weird fiction, there used to be this thing called Weird Tales and Amazing Tales, these little magazines, these sort of weekly journals, where a lot of people like H.P. Lovecraft and all got their start. Some of my personal favorites are people like Ambrose Bierce, Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen, Clark Ashton Smith, some very interesting and peculiar writers of the early 1900s. Very singular. And also I must mention a word about this performance is that this was done as a piece called Comedy of Horrors. the book is dedicated to my dear friend, the late Shiv Subramaniam, who recently passed away, and he was a hero of mine since childhood, and he was also someone who, him and the other actors in that play, they were slightly Shakespearean kind of actors. They were slightly from the more classical school, you know, and it was such a privilege and a joy to direct him and others, Denzel Smith, Joy Fernandez, Jemini Pathak, some of my favorite actors in Motley since I was a child, in this play, Comedy of Horrors. And it had a piece by Ambrose Bierce and two pieces by Poe. And this piece which I did was a sort of replacement piece. So when one of the actors wasn't available, so I would sort of step in and do this A Tale of the Ragged Mountains, which isn't a very funny piece because that was called Comedy of Horrors. That was more about a sort of mixture of comedy and horror, the genres. But this one is certainly towards, you mentioned the possible role of drugs, but I don't know if it was drugs as much as it was the movement of surrealism, probably, the sort of, the slightly, the surrealistic nature of the story, the evocation of the uncanny, all these kinds of things, the mystical nature of it too. And that's something that affected the novel also, because the novel also deals with the mountains. The novel is about an expedition to the mountains in the Himalayas, which is definitely, so there's the only long form, the only novella which Poe ever wrote is called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which was literally almost like a blueprint for Forsaken Wilderness. It was a huge inspiration for the book. And he only wrote one novella because he believed that the literary experience is to be had in one sitting. So he only wrote short stories and he only wrote poems. He only wrote one long form piece. And he also was someone who was into the sort of cosmic. And that also is something that's probably reflected in the book, in the Forsaken Wilderness. His preoccupation with the cosmic.
I had an
Please go ahead.
So I had an observation. So while we talk about the surreal and extraterrestrial aspects of his work, very few people know that he was also one of the first detective writers. So he had a very he had a very famous detective called Dupin. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it right.
Absolutely. And that's such a good point that you've made. It's a very important point because did you know that apparently that the murders in the Rue Morgue was what influenced Conan Doyle to create Sherlock Holmes, right?
Exactly. So that's what I was coming to. So in fact, he was the precursor to Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly.
But in history, we sort of have forgotten him, and Conan Doyle is like more famous.
Exactly.
But recently there was this movie which came out on Netflix called A Pale Blue Eye.
Pale Blue Eye. How is it?
You've not watched it?
I've not watched it.
It's not that great.
It's not
but
that
it's
great.
on Poe.
It's on Poe.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, my question was: is there a resurgence in the interest in Poe because of this movie? It had like this Christian Bale star, Pale Blue Eye, and all coming up. So, do you see a resurgence in interest in Poe?
Possibly, I'm quite sure. There's always been a sort of interest in Poe, and especially in the 60s. There was these the first Edgar Allan Poe adaptations goes really back to the old Universal horror films of the 30s with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. And in fact, the acting style which you all witnessed today was a big sort of homage to that style. Those guys were considered hams in their days. They weren't realistic actors. They were over the top. I really loved that acting style, and I wanted to sort of pay homage to that also with the slightly crazy nature of the performance, the acting style. But so it's interesting that in the 60s, Vincent Price, who's one of my favorite actors, he basically did a series of Poe adaptations, of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, and directed by this great director Roger Corman. And so I think at that time also for a huge generation, there was a big resurgence in Poe interest because of those films. They were B movies. They were like B grade, like Ramsey Brothers type of films. They were, but obviously like more little different. But like those Vincent Price films were really amazing, and especially Vincent Price and Poe together is a great marriage of actor and author. Like all the great actors, and especially actors of a slightly thespian bent, not the slightly method realistic actors, but the slightly classical actors who were also going out of fashion in the 60s. There was always, if you see this, like think about like Laurence Olivier's relationship with Shakespeare, or Vincent Price's relationship with Poe. There's a great marriage that happens of actor and writer.
Someone that, so you were speaking of the sentence constructions. Right?
Yes.
So very often, at least in my undergrad, I was taught, show, don't tell.
Yeah.
So how do you think, because I feel with this, he's just been telling.
Yes.
But of course, there is a lot of imagination going on, the telling helps. So do you think in the genre of detectiveness, it is important to have that element of telling to, or you want that element of show to enhance that curiosity? That's one question. And assuming he was on drugs,
Yes.
we know of a lot of authors and artists who are either, they do amazing work when they're like extremely sad, say they're on drugs, and we've heard of theories where drugs, enhance creativity. So do you think you would have been such a good artist?
No, I don't think, you cannot attribute his brilliance and his genius to drugs, because Poe didn't need drugs. He was already like that. He was already quite, his imaginative faculties were already very advanced without the use of drugs. This is what I personally believe. And that's also the case with a lot of great artists of that nature, is that they didn't perhaps need drugs. And I don't know actually about Poe's drug usage that much. He must have done various morphine and whatnot at that time. Opium, I know a lot of those, the 18th century poets were all, a lot of them did opium. Coleridge and all also. But I don't think you can attribute his, even the others, their brilliance to drugs. I think that's...
Do you think this mystery and this curiosity, this unknown thing that we have attributes and makes them a bit more intriguing?
Yes,
that attracts
absolutely. There's a sort of enigmatic quality,
Correct.
to what made them the way they were. And I think so drugs was probably a byproduct of what they were rather than the sort of governing principle of what they were, I think, Drug, but sorry, the first question is also very interesting what you were saying about the show don't tell thing. And the thing with Poe is definitely there is an over descriptiveness. He's almost over describing. It's almost like how there's over the top acting, there's over the top writing. It's like that almost, and hence in that regard, I think especially his, the great thing about Poe and show don't tell, that sort of aspect of it is that a person like Poe in his stories, he would bury his exposition among heaps of data and things which he was telling the reader, right? So within that a lot of wealth of material, you would not be realized that you're being told a story as the story was progressing. So it was almost like a style of reader misdirection. Like you wouldn't realize while you're reading that you're actually being told a plot. It is not very like overt ki this is the motions of the plot, you're going from point A to point B to point C to point D. It was you didn't realize yourself that you're being told a story. It was very interesting how he did exposition. He was a master of that. And Murders in the Rue Morgue is a great example of that. Because in that he shows and he tells also. But yet, it's funny that how he would utilize the heaps of data and seemingly inconsequential details to a mystery or to a story. Because not all of his stories were mystery, a lot of them were. But sometimes he would also write, like he wrote this lovely short story called The Philosophy of Furniture, which is about interior decoration. Like, the landscape garden. So he was a man of many sort of interests, obviously.
So also can you then come to the conclusion that this kind of writing perhaps also, builds up to the suspense?
Yeah, okay, I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because what's really specific about Poe is that he uses the convoluted long sentence style to build suspense. That's, you hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly what he's doing. Because he is using a sort of, almost like a protracted, he's, almost stretching the tension, like a rubber band almost, as the cliche goes. And he is doing that in order to protract the suspense and the release of that suspense. Because he's using words. It's amazing. Observe the way in which he uses the design and arrangement of words to create suspense. In the same way, a lot of poets or other writers use the design and arrangement of words to create a poetic effect. He would use it to create a suspenseful effect. And it's no surprise that apparently the filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock was Poe was a huge, important thing in his life, In fact, Hitchcock once said the reason he makes mystery films is because as a child he loved Poe.
Could you tell us a little more about the creation of this performance and its development?
So as I said that we did this play Comedy of Horrors in 2015 with some of my favorite actors since I was a child from our theatre company Motley. And this performance was actually what I had prepared this from 2014. And I sort of performed this to sort of to give them an idea of what their pieces are like. And their pieces are also amazing. I wish, inshallah, someday we should do the whole. Shiv is no more, unfortunately, but his spirit lives on
to this play. You know, my performance is a tribute, it's a homage to him, and the book is dedicated to him. He was a dear friend of mine, I'll tell you what the play was. Very interesting comedy of horrors. There was 3 pieces. One was called Moxon's Master by Ambrose Bierce, which is actually a story about AI. It's about a chess playing automaton. And it's about the narrator who Shiv was playing. He is playing chess with this automaton, and him and his friend have a long discussion about the nature of whether non-sentient beings, whether everything is sentient. You know, even if an object is not an inanimate object. That story was exploring that kind of stuff. That's very interesting. And then at the end, what happens is that he says the chess playing automaton kills him because the narrator beats him at chess. So after he does checkmate, the automaton gets angry and kills him. It's a great story, Moxon's Master. The second piece was called The Man That Was Used Up, which is an insane piece by Poe. That was done by Jemini Pathak, and that is truly one of the most insane pieces ever written. I won't spoil it for you all. You all should check out that piece. It's a very, very shocking piece. The third one was a great piece called The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, done by this lovely actor, Joy Fernandez. I don't know if any of you all have seen the film Jajantaram Mamantaram. Joy is like, again, one of our dear friends, and he's an amazing actor. So Joy, and he's a great comedy actor. He's like almost like our version of Jim Carrey. You know, he's a great comedy actor. He's a great comedian. And so he basically did this piece, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor, which is about a mental institution where the inmates have basically taken over the asylum and locked up the keepers and the caretakers and the doctors and basically assumed their place. So the narrator wanders into this asylum thinking that the people who he's interacting with are the officials, but they're actually the inmates. And this happens again, like Poe's great suspense. He unravels this mystery as the story progresses. So this Tale of the Ragged Mountains was like an 11th man in a cricket team. It's like a substitute piece, you know. So when one of the actors, like if Gemini was not available, he was off on a shoot or something, I would step in, like kind of thing. So this was very much, this piece was devised at that time, and it was also devised because, so let me say a word about this format of theatre in itself. It's called Dastan Go, like a person, single actor performing an entire short story or a work of prose, playing all the characters, doing the staging. That is a sort of a specific tradition. We did a play called Ismat Apa Ki Naam Ismat Chukta Hai story. I mean, we did that with the works of Manto, Premchand, Harishankar Parsai, Krishan Chandra. The practice of adapting pre-existing works of prose and dramatizing them. You know, because also the thing is, in today's day and age, we can't do a lot of the great playwrights, their cast list is too long. So it's difficult to perform Shakespeare in today's day and age because there are 30 people in the cast. Like, how can you do, because it's difficult, logistically it's difficult. So hence, what we started doing in Motley, our practice was to take a pre-existing work of prose and dramatize it for the stage. So this was definitely a part of that spirit, you know, of that attempt to do something of that sort. But also, again, I must re-emphasize is that it was a slightly different style of acting that one wanted to try to do, which was slightly hammy style, slightly over the top, slightly classical, and that sort of thing, you know. Because I believe that, of course, now we're going through a great phase of realism in acting, but sometimes I feel that there should be a child at play quality to acting. It should be like there should be a mad scientist quality to it, you know. So this was definitely an attempt in that vein.
Can I ask a question? How long did it take for you to write this book that you've written, and is it your first book or?
No, this is my third book, and this actually took the most amount of time to write, because this is also my first foray into literary fiction. The first 2 were hard-boiled pulp crime novels, and they were perhaps slightly took less time to compose. This one took a great deal of time. It is also something that was a work in progress for many years, over the course of many years. And Simon and Schuster is so wonderful because they allowed me to try this literary experiment. Because you know, a lot of publishing houses would have said, no, you should clip the sentences. Don't make it in this register of prose. You might alienate the reader. And I was very scared of that because a reader might have been alienated by it because it's a very old school style of prose. And thankfully, that's not been the case. I mean, people have responded positively also. So, but yes, this one took a great deal of time, and probably it existed in various incarnations over the years from 2014-15 onwards. But that doesn't mean that that sounds a little grandiose, as if I was sitting and laboring over a tome for 10 years. It's not like that. You work on other stuff over the years and then revisit something and then rearrange it and try to put it together.
But in earnest, it actually started 2020, right before COVID, I started arranging it into novel form. But the material was there from Penny.
I'm asking one more question.
Ah.
Okay. I'm asking this because I want to understand the actor's perspective on this. So, we've had a lot of movie adaptations on this, right? And very vividly, as we can all see, theatre as an art. And some people, the ones who are, say, quite open-minded about it, can say movies can also be an extension of the theatre performance. One can also say that. But we also have orthodox people who, theatre is one form and they completely put away the movie as another form of, acting. So, how do you think, given that, for example, if I want to watch a theatre play in this time and age, I have to do a lot of Googling. But if I want to book a movie, it's just as
Yes.
So, do you think, whether or not the multimedia and the movie has actually taken over this art form, because we have very limited resources for theatre viewing. So, what do you think, as an actor, given that you have exposure to say both of it, what do you think holds the difference of how? Let's just address the gray area that we have here, this transition. Could you just throw some light on the transition?
Yes, that the movies or the visual media have sort of, what you're saying is that they've kind of replaced what the place theatre used to have in society, almost in a sense. Now people used to go on the weekend or after a hard day's work to the theatre. Earlier, now they'll switch on a movie or they'll go to the theatre cinema hall to watch a film. I think that's probably the case, definitely. But I think that, no, you know what is interesting? It's a twofold thing. Because now more than ever, I think there is a sort of yearning amongst the audience to see a live performance. To whether it's a live concert versus, not CDs don't exist anymore, but like however we listen to music, as opposed to actually seeing a band perform live or musician perform live. Similarly, and so there's a big yearning for that. Similarly with theatre, also because of the vast proliferation of visual media, there's so many films and shows to watch. There's a different kind of energy that the audience feels in a theatre. Because the exchange of energies in a theatre between the performer and the audience is unparalleled. That is what is one of the really defining characteristics of the theatre. And that cannot be replaced by any medium. And also there's always been a great symbiosis between film and theatre. The theatre was, the cinema was spawned from the theatre. At one point, it was in the early days when cinema was created, they used to refer to it as the illegitimate offspring of the theatre. So, and then, certain directors made the cinema into an art form, or on itself, on its own right. So there's been and especially the connection between literature and cinema has also been very old, since the beginning itself. Like all the early practitioners of film, they wanted to bring the prestige of a Tolstoy or a Dickens into cinema. Because at that time, cinema was not taken seriously. It was like a Nickelodeon novelty, and like how video games, you go to an amusement park or the arcade. That's how cinema was in its nascent phase. It wasn't, then certain people made it into an art form. The Russian, Eisenstein or Griffith or many others, they all made it into an art form. Which was, then it had the same prestige as literature and theatre.
Talks about an actor's craft, right?
Yeah.
Theatre versus cinema.
Yeah, exactly.
In front of an audience, the immediate feedback.
The immediate feedback, the sort of the continuous nature of it, the fact that it's not a stop and start, that kind of thing.
One thing I find very please, and I think I've taken off.
I have one question about horror as a genre in film.
Yes.
It's been a long time. I thoroughly enjoy horror. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed new material in horror. The last bit that I enjoyed was a Lovecraftian sort of a story.
Yes. Which one?
Midnight Mass.
Oh, I heard about this.
Yeah, and it was very well directed, well performed, and but I don't find many like that around me.
Yeah.
You ever wonder why
I agree.
that's been? I actually blame it on the Conjuring series. But that's a personal take. But if you feel like there's any other influence.
That's a very good point, Aditi, and you're absolutely right. I agree with you completely. Is that the horror, one of the worst
influences on modern horror is the jump scare.
Yeah.
You know, people have become completely, a lot of contemporary horror films depend on the jump scare. They get a lot of dishonest thrills from the audience. You know, they don't earn their scares. Suddenly the guy go in, open the cupboard and suddenly he'll happen like that. It's not, that's not a earned scare. I think one needs to, the great horror practitioners, some of the great horror films, they were eerie rather than scary. You know, there's a difference. Exactly, they built, there was a very indescribable quality to them, you know, whether it's The Shining or whether it's any of those classic, the great horror films. But there was something very almost abstract about them. They weren't as conventional as today's horror is often. I'm also probably speaking from a place of ignorance because I'm sure there's great horror, also contemporary, maybe we have, yeah. But I know what you're talking about, the general tendency is towards that jump
One
scare
has to
thing.
hunt now.
Sorry?
One has to hunt for.
One has to hunt for. From many other countries apparently, yeah. I believe there's a very good Argentinian horror film which recently came out. So there's this stuff happening, but one doesn't always, doesn't reach.
Question.
Yes.
Did Poe also, like Conan Doyle, was he a spiritualist? All this dabbling in the supernatural and Ouija boards and all of that.
No, I don't think he dabbled in any of that, but he is actually senior to Conan Doyle.
Right.
So I don't think he knew Conan Doyle.
Yeah, but spiritualism was around.
Yes, exactly. The seance thing and whatnot, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, Poe's actually, he also never wrote about that kind of thing. Because he always approached horror from a very rationalist point of view. He was someone he actually dabbled very less in the supernatural. And that's again something that in the book also for Secular is the same thing. Is that it's a horror novel which does not deal with ghosts and spirits. Instead, it deals with scientifically unexplainable phenomena, which is potentially even eerier. And so Poe was very much in that vein. He did not write that much about ghosts and spirits. What would happen was that a lot of his horror was founded often in science and in reason, and the sort of the aberrations of science and the aberrations of reason and logic. You know, the sort of blank spaces that are left in mankind's estimation of physical reality of the real world. And so that's why he was so much into the cosmic aspect of it, you know. And probably one of the earliest people that alluded to extraterrestrial, although he never overtly wrote anything about extraterrestrials.
You also have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yes, exactly. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein predates Poe by quite a few years actually. I think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein like 1815, around early 18, and also at that time some of the earliest horror novels ever, like the Castle of Otranto. Oh, also this one, let's not forget Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was around the same time as Frankenstein. Yeah, that was also another great beginning. That's the genesis of horror genre in literature. By Washington Irving, that one and Frankenstein, they're probably the first two proper horror novels.
Otranto. Castle of Otranto. The first.
Sorry?
Castle of Otranto was the first.
Castle of Otranto was the first, no? Yes. That was, I think, in the late 1700s.
Yes.
Yeah. But thank you all so much for coming. It was such a pleasure to perform for you. Huge thanks to PIC and IFA for having me here, and for Simon & Schuster for delivering the books, and for Motley. Thank you, everyone.